Hi, it's Elizabeth Willits here from Investing in Women, and I'm delighted because today we are with Tom Stenner-Evans from Thrive Law. He's an employment solicitor with Thrive Law, and we're going to be discussing about discrimination in recruitment and how you can protect yourself and your organisation. So we are live today on Facebook and on LinkedIn. So thank you to everyone that is joining us today. If you could let us know if you can hear us all right, give us a like or an emoji, and if you've got any questions on this topic as we're going through, and just pop them in the chat. So thank you so much for joining us. I'm with Tom Stenner-Evans, an employment solicitor with Thrive Law. So thank you ever so much, Tom, for joining us. This is the second live we've done together, and the first one we did was amazing. So I'm so excited talking about this one with you as well. So thank you so much for your time today.
My pleasure. It's nice to see you again.
Yeah.
Obviously, the first one didn't go too badly. I got a call back, so the person wasn't too much of a disaster. Thank you for having me. Interesting topic as well. Interesting.
Yeah. So before we start, I guess the first question is, what is discrimination in recruitment? So what would qualify as that?
Oh, okay. I'm straight in with a sort of a broad question. Yeah. So the reason why I think discrimination has a particular focus in recruitment is because, unlike a lot of employment rights, which people would associate things like the right to an unfair dismissal, the right to redundancy payments, the sort of things like that, you can allege discrimination and you can discriminate against people even if you don't actually employ them. And there's specific wording in the Equality Act which prevents you from treating people less favourably in terms of the arrangements that you put in place when deciding to whom to offer employment or the terms on which to offer employment. So it is specifically covered in the legislation so that applicants have the ability to challenge what they think might be discriminatory decisions.
Okay.
And it's quite broad, really. So the concept of arrangements, which is one of those words in the Equality Act that is well litigated, as you can imagine, is construed very broadly. So it could be the decision to whom you offer employment, it could be the format or the content of application forms, it could be the location or timing or physical arrangement of interviews, the job specs, person specs. All of those things could potentially give rise to discrimination if they disadvantage someone who has a protected characteristic.
Okay.
And by that, I mean, I think we probably touched upon this last time.
Yes, so people might not know what is a protected characteristic.
Yeah. So there are certain characteristics which you can use as the base to lodge a discrimination claim. I suppose, strange though it sounds, you can treat people less favourably for certain reasons, and you shouldn't, but you can, if it falls outside of the framework of the Equality Act. And there are 9 protected characteristics, so age, race, sex, sexual orientation, disability, ethnicity. I think I'm probably forgetting at least 1 or 2 there. But there's a list which you can Google easily, which is all of the protected characteristics. Now, those are the only characteristics on which you can actually be subjected to discrimination under the Equality Act. So if I said to you, for example, I don't want to recruit that person because they're physically unattractive and we only want beautiful people in our office.
Yeah.
Now that's very unfair, appalling, you might even say, but it probably doesn't technically fall within a protected characteristic.
Okay.
Because younger people can be attractive, older people can be attractive, men can be attractive, women can be attractive, people of different races and ethnicities can be attractive. So that in itself probably doesn't get you into the discrimination framework. But if you were choosing, let's say, men over women or white people over ethnic minorities, then you're into discrimination territory.
Okay. All right. Do we not all fall under some sort of protected characteristic?
Well, yes, potentially. I mean, people like me who are white, heterosexual males in their 30s,
I don't want to recruit a white heterosexual man, for example, and that would be discrimination. Would that?
Well, okay, yeah, okay. Interestingly, we're jumping about 10 steps ahead to something called positive action.
Okay.
Yes, you're absolutely right. Everyone technically has a protected characteristic, and let's say, for example, you were recruiting into a very dominantly female industry, let's say the beauty sector or something like that, and I said I want to come and be a beautician in your team, okay?
Yeah.
And you didn't want me because people think it's weird if it's a man, okay? Just to use a flippant example. Then yeah, potentially I could say you have treated me unfairly and you've discriminated against me because I'm a man, and that's a characteristic. Now, the likelihood of it happening that way around is quite slim, and much in the same way that you don't often come across white people being discriminated against in England and Wales because of their race or ethnicity. It's less likely to happen. So yeah, technically you're correct. We all have protected characteristics. But there are some of us, and I include myself in that, who are far less likely to be on the receiving end of it. You know?
Yeah.
And the positive action point is that there is a carve out which allows employers, when recruiting, to use lay terms, I suppose, to favour a certain disadvantaged group. So you can take proportionate measures to enable or to encourage people with a certain characteristic to perhaps apply for a job.
Okay.
So let's say if you're very underrepresented in ethnic minorities, you could actively promote an interest in recruiting an ethnic minority or a woman if you're an all-male team. There's a lot of hurdles to overcome. They have to be as qualified as, it has to be what's called a proportionate means of achieving a legitimate aim. You tend to find employers steer clear of it because it's on one side of a line which is lawful, whereas positive discrimination, which is more overt, is not lawful. So what you tend to find is employers, rather than actively push this positive action, if they're good employers, will invest time in identifying the likelihood of discriminating at the outset and then reducing that risk anyway, so that the best candidate will get the job regardless of any protected characteristics.
Okay. Christina, she's just listed on Facebook the characteristics like age, disability, gender reassignment, marriage and civil partnership, pregnancy and maternity, race,
religion and philosophical belief. Yes, so philosophical belief is something usually that's not religious, but for example, it's a strongly held belief that's capable of respect in a democratic society. Good example being veganism. For example, you can't discriminate against someone because they're a vegan.
Okay, all right. So why do employers need to be so mindful of discrimination laws when recruiting?
Well, a number of reasons. Take in terms of a sort of spectrum. At one end, you have the sort of pure legal reasons. At the more holistic end, you have the fact that you should be mindful of it because, number one, it's the wrong thing to do. Number two, it reflects very poorly on your company and culture. And number three, if we're trying to take positive steps towards addressing the imbalances in the current working environment, that isn't going to happen if people like me keep recruiting people who look like me.
Yeah.
But from a purely legal perspective, it's that point I touched upon early, that you can be sued by people who aren't even your employees for discrimination. Mm-hmm. I mean, technically, you could be sued by someone who doesn't even apply for the job. If they see a job advert which they think is discriminatory, they could technically sue you for it. They have difficulty in showing that they only didn't apply because of that discriminatory term, for example, but it's technically possible. Okay. And I've worked on a number of cases where employers have put out job adverts and have ended up being threatened or sued by applicants for the way that they have gone through. And if you're happy for me to just share a couple of sort of interesting war stories. Yeah. So one of them, they had a job with hundreds of applications, and an individual put in a job with his real name, and he had a an Egyptian name, I think it was.
Okay,
And
yeah.
he put in exactly the same job application with a very, very English sounding name.
Yeah.
And the English sounding name was invited to interview, and he wasn't under his Egyptian name. Exactly the same CV, nothing different. And so he said, why is this? They're exactly the same CV. Why have I not been invited? And my English made up name has. And that's very, very difficult to defend that. Because really, like, what is your reason? The other side to it that I've seen is that this is quite susceptible to vexatious litigation. So there will be people, because you don't even have to take a job, who will look for job adverts that they feel are potentially discriminatory and will apply for the job with no intention of actually getting it, just to threaten discrimination and to make, £1,000, £1,500 off the employer to settle it.
Really?
So that's sort of,
like ambulance chaser.
yeah. Well,
it sounds a bit.
If you apply for 100 jobs and you aren't invited to interview, and you say you haven't invited me to interview because I'm female or because I'm a certain race or I'm a certain age, well, it's prohibitively challenging and expensive and time-consuming to go to a tribunal. There will be some employers who will say it's worth £1,000 for this to go away quietly. So if you do that 100 times, so it's a challenging market, because you've got some employers who aren't doing it the right way, and at the other end of the spectrum, you've got some individuals who will abuse the system. So there is value to both parties in getting this right, like I said, from a legal perspective, but also because the best businesses, in my experience, are the ones that are both practically diverse, but also cognitively diverse as well, and they're often interlinked. And if you're having a recruitment process run or overseen by, let's say, all white middle-class men in their 50s, you're quite unlikely to create to generate a diverse staffing population, because people will tend to gravitate towards people who they're similar to. So it's in the business's interest to avoid these issues, both for legal reasons, but also because that's what's going to improve your business, is bringing in people from diverse backgrounds and people who bring different perspectives and skills.
What do you think about like the blind recruitment that some firms are introducing? I think where as part of the application process, people's names are taken off when they went to university. I mean, that's a personal question, really.
I see no value in having those details on CV, and I would say I'd go as far as to say that anyone who isn't doing it at this stage is behind the curve and should be considering it, unless they are very, very comfortable that the people doing it are conscious of their own biases. Then it's very risky to have all those details. I mean, you can perhaps get around it by having a sort of a cohort of recruiters who can keep each other in check, but there's no value in having someone's name or someone's gender or someone's university on there, really. All you're doing is inviting an opportunity to bring your own bias to it. To say, for example, okay, that's a woman, her date of birth is 1990. Oh, and she might think about having children soon. It's often not that blatant and overt, but if you've got that information in there, there's the chance that might be a bias for someone that they're not aware of. It's a chance that someone might overtly do it. Someone who is thinking, oh no, I need a grafter in my team, and this woman isn't going to graft her. She's got 2 kids. She's going to want to be at home all the time, which is completely unfounded and sexist and discriminatory. It doesn't mean that there aren't people who would think it. If you take that off the CV, out of the application process, you remove the risk of that even being a factor.
Yeah.
There's a very interesting story. I think it was the New York Philharmonic Orchestra had, back in the 70s, they had 6% of their players were female.
Okay.
And all the people who were doing the auditions were, of course, male.
Yeah.
So they kept recruiting men.
Yeah.
They introduced blind auditions behind curtains to say, right, we're going to listen to you play your violin or your clarinet, and we're going to pick, on talent alone. And now it's nearly 50% of women.
So how should employers do it right then? I mean, what would you think would be an ideal recruitment process from a legal perspective?
Well, I think you have to start from the very, very beginning, which is what are you advertising for? What are you putting down on paper?
Okay.
And it isn't, it's not, it's very rare to see something that says, young strapping man wanted for so-and-so role. That really doesn't happen. But, I've seen job adverts that say salesperson wanted for a young and dynamic sales team.
Yeah, you see that a lot.
Now, you might say, well, we're not asking for a young person. We're just telling you this is a young and dynamic sales team. Well, but who's going to want to join a young and dynamic sales team? Younger people. Who feels that they're more dynamic? Young people. Who's going to be more put off by that? Probably older people, potentially. Maybe people who have other responsibilities. Who knows? So it's often more subtle than you realise. So the starting point is get your job spec, get your job adverts vetted, reviewed, involve more people in the process, involve diverse people in the process, so that when something goes out to print, you know that it's going out in a way that is not going to discourage certain people.
Yeah.
Then I think when you get to the stage of reviewing CVs, make it as blind as you can, keep it as simple and as basic as possible, removes the likelihood of that happening again. When you get to interview stage, think about involving different people from different backgrounds. Have a sort of flexible process in place. So don't say all interviews taking place at 6 p.m. because that's going to be harder for women to comply with. They've probably got childcare responsibilities, for example. So think about how accommodating you are for disabled applicants as well. Will you offer Zoom interviews for people who might find it harder to travel? Things like that. It's just being alive to all of these sort of factors so that people aren't, I suppose, sort of subtly disadvantaged. I'm trying to think of other things. We have often seen they will have different levels of sift. So they'll have different people who sift.
Yeah.
I've seen good ones where you've had 3 people who sift, and the only ones who then get invited are the ones who at least one person has picked. They get invited, so that the likelihood of all 3 having the same bias is reduced. So it means more people into a long list, but it does mean that 3 different people, hopefully from different backgrounds who have different views, are looking at it, so that you aren't leaving it to one person who is potentially going to favour a certain group of people.
Yeah.
The other thing as well, I think, once you make your decision, is keep a clear written record of why you've made that decision. Mm-hmm. So if you've chosen a candidate for 5 or 6 objectively very good reasons, they've got more experience, they've got certain niche skills in a subsector that you need, they've got, a long history of public speaking, and this is a client-facing role, for example, then just document that.
Yeah.
Because if the person who was unsuccessful happens to have a protected characteristic and say, well, I think that you didn't recruit me because I'm Asian, then you can say, no, it's not. It has nothing to do with that. Here was your feedback. You performed quite well. You scored X, Y, and Z on these particular categories, but someone scored higher. This person ended up getting the job. Keep it as objective as possible. If you can have a scoring matrix, do so. All of those things should eliminate risks of making discriminatory decisions.
Yeah. Okay. And someone on Facebook had a good question. How would you know if you had been discriminated against? If you'd been rejected? That was such a good question.
Yeah, that is a good question, right? Remind me to come back to a couple of the questions from Sonia in particular.
And Christina as well.
Yes, I'll come back to those after answering your question. How do you know if you've been discriminated against? Well, like I said, it's often not that overt, so it's often very difficult to know. Like, you're unlikely to be told that you're a bad fit for the team because you're a certain religion or something like that. I mean, most employers aren't that brazen. I think sometimes it comes down to asking for feedback, and if the feedback doesn't seem to tally up, if you feel like particularly internally potentially as well. Like there's no real objective ground for not giving you the role. I mean, perhaps if you were a great candidate and they didn't recruit anyone, maybe and went back out to a second round, something like that. I mean, you sort of get a bit of a spider sense for it, right? And I would say to people, trust your gut. If you feel like something doesn't quite tally up, take an objective and reflective view and say, well, was I as good a candidate as I thought I was? But if you keep coming to the same conclusion of, yes, I really am incredibly strong on paper, I felt like I nailed it at an interview, this feedback just does not tally with me, then there is a potential. And perhaps one of the best ways to explore it further is through what's called a subject access request, which people might be familiar with. So that's under the Data Protection Act, where you can make a request for any personal data that is held by a company as a data controller. So you could make a request and they would have to provide any personal data they hold, which would include things like interview notes. Okay. Now, interview notes are a very, very dangerous area. I have seen things go badly wrong, both for good reasons, but for bad reasons, because your handwritten notes are perfectly disclosable and should be provided as part of the subject access request. So I've seen someone in an interview who had to disclose notes that said 3 children and then circle, circle, circle around it.
Oh, okay. And they had to display.
Now, okay, so there's 2 arguments there. There's one that says, wow, okay, maybe the interviewer had 3 children and thought, how great, that's going to be something really nice to chat about. I'm going to circle it. I want to come back and find out about their ages and what schools they're in, and it'll be a nice conversation, potentially. Yeah. Perfectly innocent. But is there not a very strong argument that says, wow, your interview notes, you circled 3 children, like, and then I haven't got the job? That to me says that's an issue for you.
Yeah.
No, and well, I mean that just comes down to evidence on the day, doesn't it? So and if you make a request for feedback, and if you don't get what you need, if you make a subject access request, then anything like that will potentially come out in the wash. But it's hard to prove. It's hard to prove at that stage, isn't it? Because a lot of it is based on your sort of assumptions, conclusions that you might reach, just putting pieces together to draw a conclusion. Yeah. And like I said, it's often not that overt. Often the people doing it don't even realize that they're necessarily doing it. So it is hard to show. To me, the best way to not have to have this sort of session and to even discuss this is to educate employers on what a fair process looks like, so that the best candidates are getting the jobs regardless of age or ethnicity or gender or anything like that. Yeah. And then the hope is that we're not going to have so many people saying, I've been overlooked again as a woman, or I've been overlooked again as an ethnic minority.
I think from a recruitment perspective, not from a legal perspective, we get so many candidates that have interviews, they get no feedback at all. Yeah. And then that they can obviously make assumptions as well. So I think it's always really good practice to have a good feedback form to train your interviewers in how to provide feedback that is useful to candidates, constructive, and then obviously to provide that as well in a timely manner. This sort of goes leads into Tina's question: how long should interview notes be kept for?
We're straying into data protection here, which is not necessarily my area. I think as long as it's necessary is the rule under the data protection, or something to that effect. So you shouldn't keep them any longer than is required. Now, I would say, given that employment tribunal claims generally need to be lodged within 3 months, a little bit longer for some, although there is a sort of extension period for that. Civil claims can go up to 6 years. You see most employers will keep a sort of like 6 year as a very long stop. Mm-hmm. But a lot of people, once the sort of short period is up, so 3 to 6 months, they will set a long stop date, and they will then just get rid of things after that stage, so that they're not held for any sort of future processes or anything like that. Like I said, it's slightly outside of my area, but I would say probably if you think of 6 months as a pretty good starting point, you're unlikely to get claims after that period of time.
Victoria on LinkedIn has said unconscious bias training internally for hiring managers is something that they've rolled out, and it has really helped in the process.
Yeah, it's fantastic. I would say start at the top as well and get your sort of board, your C-suite trained in unconscious bias as well. Hiring managers is really important. At my old firm, who were really good at this, I sat on the recruitment panel, and we would sit around after the week's process and actually speak a mantra so that we didn't use any sort of unconscious bias, and we'll have training as well, so that everyone is coming to that is saying, like, I'm mindful of bias and I'm not going to bring it to this process. Because if you have conscious bias, you can work around that. If you know what your bias is, then it's possible, to avoid it. CIPD says 6 months for keeping notes. Yeah, perfect. Yeah, I would agree with that. Can I just jump back to Sonia's comment that men pick their children up at 6 p.m. too? Sonia, absolutely. I probably do more of the childcare in our family than my wife does. She works full time. So I can completely relate to that. But there's still a statistical fact that women have more childcare responsibilities than men, which therefore gives them the ability to bring an indirect sex discrimination claim if, for example, a requirement to work full time is imposed or something like that. Women are still more disadvantaged by things that have to happen in evenings and weekends in their own childcare. I mean, I would hope it will get to the point where that is less of an issue, but at the moment, statistically, that's still the case.
We've had a question from Sarah. They've had training. I'm just read it out for people on Facebook who won't have seen it. So we've had training, but how is this regulated within decision making and scoring out of 10 on interviews? It's hard to challenge sometimes.
How is this? Well, Sarah, it's not an exact science, is it? Because if you're scoring out of 10, there is still always going to be some subjectivity to it. You're always going to be able to say, I'd give someone a 7 because. Now, I would always say have very good criteria for what a 1, a 2, a 3, a 4, etc. looks like. I mean, sometimes scoring out of 10 is difficult because you've got 10 different options. And what's the difference between a 6 and a 7? That's hard. Whereas if you go, say, 1 to 5 or 1 to 3, even, you can set quite clear parameters where someone can clearly be a 3, but you can identify a clear and objective jump to what needs to be a 4. As soon as you put more categories in, each category has a smaller range. It's therefore harder to justify. So I would scale it back a little bit if possible. But there is no hard and fast rule. It just comes with the training and the experience. And also, I think, having different people. So that if I was doing this with Liz and I said, I like this candidate because, then Liz is there as a foil to say, well, hang on a second. I think you're giving, too much recency bias here. You're thinking too much about what they did in the last 6 months of their job, but the 15 years before, that's completely irrelevant. Or, just use that as an example. Or to say, well, you have put too much stock in the fact that this person likes the same ice hockey team that you do. So now all of a sudden, it's going to be your new best friend. Let's take it back to the job spec, just to give a couple of slightly facetious examples.
That leads in, I think, to Sarah's question. What are your thoughts about setting up diverse interview panels, and how would you?
I absolutely, I think it's a brilliant idea. You want the interview panel to reflect the broadest possible range of skills and cognitive diversity as possible, in my view. And having 3 clones do an interview, you might as well just have one person. What's the point? Bring in people from different perspectives, people from different backgrounds, people who've had different educations and different experiences, people from different ethnicities. I would love to see an interview panel for a team that has someone quite junior on it. Let's bring in someone who isn't the senior exec manager and let's have their input. Someone who's been in the business for 2 years and is a graduate, or is someone who's come up through an apprenticeship scheme. Let's have someone who can bring genuine diversity of thought to an interview process, as opposed to having everyone who's done, the Oxbridge route, 10 years at the company, promotions X, Y, and Z, because they're going to have exactly the same views as one another, or very similar views. So, I would say the same. In much the same way as I advocate for shadow boards. Now, I haven't actually come across many people who use them, but I love the idea of a shadow board made up of people who are not in the senior exec team, but very high performers, maybe younger people who work part-time, perhaps people who are less experienced, who bring that diversity of thought to a board, which is most likely senior experienced people, largely male. So, bringing that in, I think it's a fantastic idea. Younger people on a recruitment panel are going to bring good ideas around innovative processes, something that sets you apart from competitors.
I did something actually. It was on mentoring a few weeks ago with someone that set a mentoring program, and he was a real advocate for reverse mentoring, which was somebody more junior reversing mentoring someone really senior with the organization.
Completely agree. There's a very good book called Radical Candor. It's spelled the American way, so no U in candor, by Kim Scott, which talks about sort of upwards feedback and transparency and things like that, which is sort of one step away from that. But if you've got senior people with a growth mindset who want to learn and develop, I think that's imperative. I mean, I'm 39, and I'm quite progressive for a 39-year-old white male heterosexual middle class lawyer, I like to think. But I couldn't tell you anything really about like Gen Z culture and the value of certain social media and certain types of tech. Like things like TikTok baffle me. I can't see any value in TikTok at all. There might be something I'm missing. So I would hope that the younger people in our team would say, Tom, just because you've always done it a certain way, we should be utilizing this for X, Y, and Z. And like, if you don't have a growth mindset, you probably shouldn't be in a leadership position, would be my blunt view, really. And also as well, I think that must be really engaging to have a CEO who sort of walks the shop floor and says, look, tell me what I can learn from you. I'm thinking about recruiting someone. Now here's my job spec, but we're recruiting people most likely at sort of entry level. Tell me here, what am I missing here that's not making this as good as possible? Is this reflecting your experience of our company as someone who's been here for 6 months? Things like that, because of course recruitment works both ways, doesn't it, Liz? It's not just we are so and so and you'd be lucky to work here. It's how do we convey ourselves in the best possible way to the best candidates? Like how do we convince you to come and work for us? Which I think is good that it's leveled that playing field a bit.
Massively. So we've got some questions here. Should we carry on with some of our questions? Come back to these. So, is it ever lawful to favour one group of people over another when recruiting? Yeah.
So we probably touched on that in terms of the positive action points. So yes, if you have a group that's seriously underrepresented in your organisation, then you can, if essentially all things are equal, you can actively sort of choose someone, let's say from an ethnic minority, to address that sort of imbalance. It's not done that often, but it is something that's possible. The other way where you can select someone is if you have what's called a genuine occupational requirement for a certain type of person. Now, there are very few examples of this, but let me think of one. If you might be able to hear my daughter in the background, she's charging around. If you're recruiting for a play, you're probably okay to only recruit or to only interview or to audition women for the role of Juliet, for example. So that's a genuine occupational requirement. If you're dealing with, if it's a role supporting victims of sexual assault or sexual abuse, you can again probably favour women in that role. I mean, that's not to say that it doesn't happen both ways, or to men as well, but things like that, rape victims, you can probably favour women. There were some, I believe all aspects of the armed forces are now open to women, including, I think, special forces. I don't think any woman has passed SAS or SBS training yet. I remember previously the Royal Marines, I think, were men only, but I think that may have changed. So that's genuine occupational requirements. Again, that doesn't come up very often.
Okay. So some things you can with favour. I'm just thinking
Yeah.
like even like as a woman, like going for a massage or a beautician. I don't know if that maybe that's.
Well, no, probably not. No, I think you can give people the option of who they prefer as a masseur or masseuse. But when recruiting, I think it would be very difficult to say we only want women or men, because of course there are lots of men who go to spas, and there are lots of women who would say, actually, I would prefer the with the stronger hands for a sports massage or a Swedish massage.
Yeah. Okay, that was just me thinking out.
Yeah, so that's probably Liz, a very good example of where you should.
My unconscious bias. That's really.
Yeah, maybe, and I think it's a very good exercise to identify your own unconscious bias. Because we had training, and I identified mine, and it was not what I expected, and it was quite surprising. It's quite humbling to realise that we all have some bias, and mine was quite pronounced, against people who've always had private school education, because I had this sort of unconscious bias that they probably never had part-time jobs, probably didn't work through uni, they probably haven't got much of a work ethic. So I had that. So I would always sort of favour the grafter who came up through the working class and started working at 14. But in fact, that's completely unfounded. But that was my unconscious bias.
Yeah.
Now that I'm aware of that, then through blind application processes, I have no idea if someone's been to a comp or if they've been to Eton. It makes no difference. It's not a relevant factor. So that takes my bias out of it.
So what is unconscious bias then? People don't know what we're talking about.
So it's essentially, it's your. I'm trying to think of the better way to describe it. We'll have sort of biases as a sort of tendency of how we see the world, and we generally see it through our own lens, and our lens has been created through our life experiences, our upbringing, our experiences, through the media that we subscribe to, our family, things like that. So your unconscious bias is your own prejudices that you're unaware of against a specific group. So it could be against gender, race, sexual orientation, or it could be something that falls outside potentially of the discrimination framework. You might be biased against people of a certain weight or people of a certain hair color. You might be biased against people who dress a certain way. You might have, for example, a predetermined view about goths because they wear black eyeliner and black hair and they wear long black trench coats, for example. Okay, like you might think, gosh, that's really unprofessional.
Yeah.
But that's not to say that person wouldn't be incredible at their job. So bias can be about a certain protected characteristic, but it can be about a certain group of people. I've heard people say that they have that their unconscious bias ended up being a prejudice towards overweight people because they felt it was an indication that they would be lazy at work, or things like that, which is unfounded, completely unfounded. So the bias can be very wide-ranging. It can be very subtle, and it's generally based around what you've grown up in. People are likely to have an unaware bias, something that is probably different to what they've experienced or what they are.
So we will all have some sorts of biases, probably. I can't.
Say that again. Sorry.
We'll all have some sort of.
Oh yeah, I would say I'd be amazed if anyone doesn't. I think it's about being open-minded enough to understand how to identify those biases, and that comes through sort of specialist training and things like that. But also, like recognizing that you have biases, and it's not a reflection on you as a person necessarily. It's the product of 20, 30, 40, 50 years of experiences and upbringing potentially. It's more important to dig them out, find out what they are, then you can address them. And if you know that you're more likely to favour men than women, then you work on that. And you surround yourself by a panel of people who do not have the same, who will keep you in check. And you say to them, if you see me favouring a male candidate for no objective reason, you call me up on it.
Yeah.
And I'll call you up on on something else.
Yeah.
And it's just about being secure enough to understand that your bias doesn't define you, but it can define someone else's career if you don't address it. So it is something that needs to be addressed. And a few people here, Sarah is saying we train not only our hiring managers, but all employees are part of the process. So they're not only trained on different bias, but how they're aligned to how to assess the candidate objectively. And that's absolutely right. It's sort of safety in numbers, isn't it? If you've got 6 people sat around a table, the hope is they don't all have the same bias. Yeah. Especially if there's 6 people that you've selected from a diverse group intentionally, you would hope that you will end up with an objective summary of who the best people are.
We've had a question on LinkedIn. I think this maybe ties into the last question we've got, and then we've got another question from somebody on Facebook that will ask. So someone's asked on LinkedIn, is there anything you think we can add to the process of the vote most value to our clients? I'm assuming that person's maybe in HR recruitment. And then this maybe ties in quite well with this question. So what tips do you have for employers to reduce the risk of making discriminatory decisions?
Yeah, that's quite an interesting comment. I mean, I'm assuming perhaps when they talk about clients that there's perhaps a recruitment element, and this is perhaps relevant to you as well, Liz, that the end user client can be liable for the discriminatory actions of their recruitment agent.
Okay.
So if they are acting as the agent, let me just have a quick look at the specific wording, because I wrote this down so that I've got this right. Where is it? It's where they have, what is the specific wording? I can't remember where I wrote it down. Essentially, if you engage a recruiter and they act in a discriminatory way, for example, they only put forward white candidates, even though there are some suitably qualified black candidates or minority ethnic candidates, then the end user client can be liable for the agency's actions, even if they don't know about them or approve them. So the end user client's got to go that bit further. And if you engage a recruitment consultant, you should be saying, right, this is our equality and our diversity policy. This is important to us. We expect you to put forward candidates from a range of backgrounds on a skills-only basis. That probably then protects you from being liable for that. But I have come across a number of cases where the recruitment agent has just dropped the ball really badly, and the client is liable because they didn't do enough to make it clear that this is what we're looking for from this recruitment process. We want a diverse range of people. We want at least X percentage of CVs to be from women for this leadership role or something like that. It's incumbent on the end user client to be telling the recruiter what they need to be doing, so that they aren't then liable for the actions. Okay. That is perhaps one of the key tips, I think. If you're engaging a recruiter, stress how important this is. Provide your policy, explain what it is you need and why. Yeah.
Okay. Brilliant. And someone said, will we be talking about age discrimination?
Age decimation, they've written even. Well, that's even worse. That's even worse than discriminating against them. We're culling them now. So age discrimination is an interesting one, because it's the same as the other protected characteristics, although you are allowed to objectively justify direct age discrimination. So you can say, look, we are not recruiting you even though you're a certain age, and it's because of your age, but here is our reason for doing that. And it's harder to justify, but it is potentially justifiable. Age discrimination is one which comes up quite often in recruitment, I think, because people assume that someone of a certain age is not going to be tech savvy, or they're not going to be interested in hanging around in the business for the succession plan or things like that. So I think it's quite important to make sure that if you require someone to have certain skills, for example, that if someone who is older has those skills, that they're treated exactly the same. If you require someone to be a social media whiz, and a 55-year-old applies and says, I'm not really very good at this whole, like face party linked Twitter thing, then then you can just say, well, I'm sorry, but you don't have the skills. And the age perhaps is the reason, potentially, they haven't embraced social media in the same way as a 20-year-old. But if you genuinely need someone to run your social media campaign, then you need someone to run your social media campaign. You've got to be savvy at social media. Now, yeah, it's more likely to favour someone who is younger, but not necessarily. I've worked with social media consultants who are, 10, 15 years older than me, trained me on LinkedIn, trained me on all sorts of things, knew far more about it than I did.
Yeah.
So it's not necessarily a barrier.
Yeah.
I think, and then that comes down to feedback, doesn't it? That comes back to saying, right, you just didn't have the skills in these 5 areas for us. Very difficult to then say, well, actually, I think it's because I'm 55 and everyone else is a 25-year-old, female, and I'm a 55-year-old man. You say, that's incidental. Yes, you are a 55-year-old man, but you're hopeless at social media. You know nothing about SEO. You don't know anything. You simply don't have the skills we need. Well, that's a claim that isn't going to get off the ground, is it? Because you've invested the time in feedback. The other thing I think about feedback is just quickly, which I'm sure you will preach, is if people have taken the time to apply for your job, take the time to give them some feedback.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's a two-way thing. It's a two-way thing.
Yeah.
Just
I think my phone's going to go off. Sorry about that. My phone went off. Do you know what?
That's all right.
Yeah, sorry about that. We've had a question from somebody on Facebook. She says she's been let go from her current company and she's 25 weeks pregnant. How does she find a company willing to take her on when they know she'll go on leave for a few months from January? And how do they get someone to see her potential rather than her circumstances?
Yeah, that's such an interesting scenario, isn't it? I would say there are 2 approaches that you can take, and it kind of depends. The likelihood of success depends on the employers that you're looking at.
Right.
I've seen great examples of someone being taken on at 8 months pregnant, and they knew she was 8 months pregnant, and they said, look, why would we care? You're a great candidate. Can't wait to have you with us in 6, 9, 12 months' time. And just getting you is brilliant. That's what we needed. But you're absolutely right. A lot of employers will look at it and go, oh, okay, you're going to go off in 3 months. Why would we pick you when we pick someone that's still going to be here? And, if it's a very small business, that might well be a factor. It can't be a factor legally, but it might well be. I think in terms of the 2 approaches, you don't have to tell anyone that you're pregnant. And if you're doing Zoom interviews and if you don't want them to know, you don't have to tell them or show them. They should be judging you as a candidate regardless. And if you get the job, you're entitled to turn up and then say, by the way, I'm pregnant, I'm going on maternity leave. And there's nothing they can do about it, nor should they want to do anything about it. Now, that's absolutely fine to do that. What I don't like about that is I don't like the fact that you should feel like you have to hide the fact that you're pregnant because people might hold it against you. It's a sad reality of where we are at the moment, but it shouldn't happen. The other thing I think is to be really upfront with them and say, look, I'm 25 weeks pregnant. I'll be going off on so-and-so date, but this is a job I really want. I think I can add loads of value. I'd be a great candidate. I will look forward to coming back after my maternity leave to support you. This is why I think I'm the best candidate for you. I think I'm worth the disruption to you. And hope that the right employer with the right values and the right priorities will ignore that and will just treat you as the best candidate if you're the best candidate. But I think probably the answer is that we're in an environment at the moment where you are disadvantaged. You shouldn't be, and it's not fair, but you are, and there's only so much at the moment that you can do about it. I think part of it is seeking out employers who have the right values and who recognise that, of course, they shouldn't take that into account.
Yeah. Also, she's seen them. They've seen a couple of companies take on women in late pregnancy recently. I have actually as well.
Yeah, and I think I'll tell you what as well. Like, you might find that if, and again, this shouldn't be the case because it tracks back to this shouldn't even be a factor. But I think you would hope that there would be an element of give and take, where the pregnant woman says, look, I recognise that even though you can't hold this against me, the fact that I'm going off in 6 weeks is an inconvenience to you, and and that you potentially could have found a way around it and perhaps recruited someone else. So I think it sets you off on a really good footing. It says, look, you're the right sort of employer, and and I will give you the best of me, because you're an employer that hasn't taken the easy route here, which is, I'll just find someone with comparable skills and I'll go for him or her instead. You haven't taken the easy route. You've taken the right one, and in return, you get the best of me, because you're the sort of employer that values its people, that is values-driven principles, and that's where I want to work. And I think that gets the best out of people. That does far more than more money or anything like that. Actually being principled and values-driven.
Brilliant. I don't think no one else seems to have got any more questions. If anyone's got any more questions while we've got Tom, let us know.
There's something about cultural fit and cultural add, which is a couple of interesting comments. Cultural fit. Fit is a tricky word in employment law. Saying someone's a good fit is always a bad and lazy way of providing feedback. Good fit, that opens you up to all sorts of things. It could be a young boozy culture, and perhaps the unsuccessful candidate is a Muslim and doesn't drink, and then you say the fit is wrong. Well, that's potentially a race discrimination claim. There's all sorts of nuances there that lazy feedback like that can create. I mean, a culture add, which is what Vic Bolton has said, is I really like. If someone's bringing something that supplements your culture from a positive perspective, that's what you should look for. If that's personality, enthusiasm, varied life skills, different thought perspective, that's the sort of things that you want.
Mm-hmm. Good. I don't know if anyone has any last minute questions for Tom, or if you want to ask some questions privately, I'm sure you'll do your best.
Yes, you can find me on LinkedIn. There aren't many people with my surname. You'll either find me, or if you find I'm a woman, you'll be finding my wife, with any Stenner-Evans. If you want to reach out with any questions or anything like that, some feedback from today. I really enjoy doing these sessions.
If you want another one with Tom, let us know.
It's fun. It's an opportunity to start bridging the gap, I think, between employment law, which is sort of quite legal and perhaps removed from the human element of human resources. I think there's this kind of big space where people can do it better in terms of how they deal with their people whilst keeping all of the law in mind. And I like talking about that side of things, about how employers can do better and things like that. So it's always fun speaking with you, Liz.
We did one, if anyone missed it a few months ago, how to make a flexible working request.
Yes, we did.
I'll put the link to that one as well, so if you missed.
Yes, if there's any topics that you're interested in on the sort of human resources, people, employment law spectrum, I'm always happy to do these sort of talks with Liz and to chat through things if there's anything that's of particular interest in. Thank you all for engaging.
Thank you for watching, and thank you so much, Tom, for your time again. It's been brilliant.
My pleasure. Nice to see you all. Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.
Thank you. Bye.